Detroit Red Wings. If you're going to talk about the greatest they've ever had, it's Gordie Howe. And I don't see that you can argue it's anybody but Gordie Howe. When I did the video almost a week ago now on the greatest player of all time, yeah, it's Gordie Howe. In many people's eyes, anyways, especially those older than me, those old enough to have seen him play, say Gordie Howe is the greatest of all time for the most part. You will get some Gretzky's, you'll get some Lemieux, but there are a lot of people who would say it was Gordie Howe. And Howe, it wasn't just his goal scoring or his points. He was tough too, and he was kind of a dirty player. There were definitely some incidents in his career that if he had played now, yeah, people would hate him. They would have. But you know what? 1,809 points in his career, 786 goals, 1,063 assists, and he led the league in scoring a bunch of times, and he was the best for a very long time. You get into some players you can argue belong in the Hall of Fame for longevity, some that belong in the Hall of Fame for being the best at what they did, and in his case, you can argue both. Power play goals, 209. So he's the all-time leader for Detroit in that category as well. So poor Steve Yzerman puts up amazing totals, does it with Detroit, so he's still seen as likely the second best to ever play for the team. Bob Probert leads him in all-time penalty minutes with 2,090. Bob Probert, a good combination of skill and toughness as well. He did have a bunch of goals, considering the game that he played. For a couple of seasons there, he was one of the best power forwards in the NHL. Also worthy of note on their best of list, you have Alex Delvecchio, you have Ted Lindsay from the distant past, and this is what proves the recency bias, so we get into arguing over who the greatest player of all time is. And we don't really talk about guys like Delvecchio and Lindsay because, we don't, and yet historians would tell you they were pretty darn good in their day as well. Nick Lidstrom, one of the best defensemen to ever play, and especially one of the best defensemen to have played in the last, I'll say, 30 years. And he definitely helped prop up that blue line. Sometimes it seemed like he was always on the ice. Like, oh yeah, Lidstrom's back on the ice. Of course he is. Did he even leave the ice? Was basically it. Pronovost, I'm putting him on the board as well. Bunch of points as a member of the Detroit Red Wings. Easy to kind of forget some of these guys were there, but Pronovost is in the Hall of Fame. Pavel Datsyuk, who will be in the Hall of Fame. It's just as soon as he's eligible, he goes in. Henrik Zetterberg. Zetterberg, I don't know that he's first ballot, but I would imagine he probably gets into the Hall of Fame. We've had that discussion before. Zetterberg had to be on the board because Datsyuk's on the board. Zetterberg has to be on the board. The two of them together, a big part of the last Stanley Cup that Detroit won. Sergei Fedorov, one of the best all-around defensive forwards, combining that defense with explosive offensive talent, and Scotty Bowman threw him on the blue line, which is a gutsy move back then. Now it wouldn't be considered a big deal. Like on a power play now, you routinely see forwards on the defense. Not that they're particularly great at playing the defensive side of it, but Fedorov was. And he could take a shift as a defenseman as well. Made things more challenging for the opposition. How do you stop those four forwards and a defenseman? And, it's Fedorov, and the defenseman might be Konstantinov. Ullman, I have on the board as well. Norm Ullman. And Brendan Shanahan. A lot of really excellent players in Detroit's history worth mentioning. And Yzerman and Howe for me are the 1-2 is the best, but Delvecchio had a pretty decent run. Ted Lindsay, pretty important career for that guy as well, known as Terrible Ted Lindsay. There were some players who played for the Detroit Red Wings that people may not have liked him a whole lot. Sid Abel as well, we can throw into the conversation of the best who've played for Detroit. Wins, we get into the goaltenders, and Terry Sawchuk, 350. Save percentage, Glenn Hall, 926. Shots against, that's Jimmy Howard, 15,313. And if you've watched the last couple of years, you would think most of those shots have been over the last couple of seasons. Shutout leader all time is Terry Sawchuk with 85. And when we get into the best goaltender conversation and that argument over who the best goaltender is, Sawchuk doesn't get mentioned nearly as much unless it's somebody who's old enough to have seen Sawchuk play. In which case, Sawchuk gets into that conversation and very often wins it. So if you ask somebody who's over a certain age, who's the best goaltender, War, Brodeur, or Hasek, they'll say Sawchuk. Sawchuk's the best out of those three. When you say that wasn't an option, they'll go, Sawchuk. Osgood deserves mention here. Chris Osgood, I've done videos on Osgood. I inducted him into my Hall of Fame because I think he was a pretty damn good goaltender during a couple of those cup runs. But did he get proper credit for it? No, not really. Will he ever? It hasn't come yet, so probably not. Dominic Hasek, of course, who went to Detroit and won himself a Stanley Cup, and that was kind of sort of fantastic for him. And because he had been through trying to drag the Buffalo Sabres there, and it just wasn't going to happen. So he goes to Detroit and wins it. And Harry Lumley deserves mention as well. Lumley, who predates everybody else on the board in net, and he put up some really good stats for them as well. Pretty sure he's in the Hall of Fame too. So Detroit's had their share of pretty darn important players. So we get into notable captains. Henrik Zetterberg, Steve Yzerman, Danny Gare. Danny Gare was their captain for a while. Danny Gare is one of those guys. I'm going to do a video at some point on players who, had really good but short careers, and Danny Gare would be in that list. Del Vecchio, Gordie Howe, Lindsay, Abel, some real legends have been captains of this team. And so while Detroit is down right now, and it's been a really, really rough last couple of years for Detroit fans, when you look at the overall history, it would tell you this team's going to bounce back. They're going to be a contender again, and the likelihood of Detroit winning a Stanley Cup again, pretty darn good. Just because when you look at their history. The thing is, there's like a 40-year break in between championships. So, like going from, I think it was 55 through to 97. So, their last one was 08, so it'll be 19. By about the 2040s, maybe 2050s, they'll be back to winning a bunch of Stanley Cups. So, there you go. There will be Stanley Cups, I just don't know when. That's the best hedge you're going to get. Now, for best team, I went with the 2001-2002 Cup champions. Shanahan, Fedorov, Hull, Lidstrom, Robitaille, Yzerman, Larionov, Chelios, Datsuk, Hasek. All in the same team, and it's not a super team put together by yourself on EA, on any of the EA NHL games. That's the team they had. Not really fair. Not fair at all. The 0-2 team was pretty impressive. So that for me is their best team. The most points they had was 95-96 when they had 131. And of course, that year they didn't end up winning a Stanley Cup. And that was right before they broke their I'm not going to say curse because I don't really believe in curses, but their curse. Most wins, that's Chicago. They've scored the most wins against Chicago, 369 over their long history against one another. And it is kind of a shame they're not still in the same division. Wings-Hawks games, some of their series were really, really good. It is a shame that rivalry's kind of sort of done. Most points, so points percentage, not most points, points percentage against the Minnesota Wild, they have the best one of 680. So I got into Norris Division talk, and I almost said Minnesota North Stars, but caught myself. Minnesota Wild. 680 is the points percentage against Minnesota. Goals for against Chicago, again, 2,292. Not really a surprise that their records would be against Chicago at all. Goals for per game, that's against Winnipeg, who were, of course, Atlanta as well for some of this, 3.64 goals per game. And goals against per game, continuing that theme of teams from the 90s and beyond expansions, Ottawa. Against Ottawa, they've allowed an even 2 goals per game. And so that's another interesting stat along the way as we continue to go through. And I'm trying to think of a team that had a goals against of lowest, or a goals against that was lowest against somebody that wasn't one of the 90s expansion or beyond. But we'll keep throwing that stat up there because it is interesting. So against Ottawa, they have a good time keeping the puck out of their own net. GM and coach. With coach, I went with Scotty Bowman. Scotty Bowman is one of those divisive guys. So I know you can look now at the number of cup rings and say, well, how could anybody argue that Scotty Bowman isn't the best coach? Easy. People always said, well, look at the teams he had. Look at the teams he had in Montreal and Pittsburgh and Detroit. I would counter with right. And how many of those teams struggled to win championships before or after he got there? Before he got there and after he left. The only place where it didn't work for Bowman was Buffalo. And I that one's still baffling to me, but you know, I guess he just didn't have a team that was good enough to get over the hump. And for Bowman, yeah, again, I don't see anybody else that I would put into that category. They've had some really good coaches. You know, Babcock was there forever, but Bowman for me was still their best coach. Best GM, I went with Jack Adams. Jack Adams was their GM from 1927 to 1962. During that period, I believe they won like 7 Stanley Cups, something like that. So, yeah, he was general manager for a very long time, and for that reason, I made him best GM. I know there's going to be people who say Holland, but I can't. Just for the amount of time and the amount of championships they won with Jack Adams as the general manager, I had to kind of leave that as it was. Now, in the he was a Red Wing category, magic, there it is. He was a Red Wing category. Going in reverse order, I tried to go from the bottom of games played up. Wendell Clark. Wendell Clark was a Red Wing briefly. Daryl Sittler finished his career as a Red Wing, which was odd because he should have finished it as a Maple Leaf. All of the ways that he got traded and what led to it and all of that I've discussed in Harold Ballard videos previously. Bernie Federko finished his career as a Red Wing as well, which is odd because he's kind of Mr. St. Louis Blues, right? Daniel Alfredson, he finished his career as a member of the Detroit Red Wings. There's kind of a theme there, isn't there? Mark Howe. Mark Howe actually did play for the Detroit Red Wings long after his father had retired, but Mark Howe was a Detroit Red Wing for roughly 100 games. Johnny Busick. Busick, known for, of course, being a Boston Bruin forever. He as well played for the Detroit Red Wings. Brad Park. Brad Park. I believe that was the end of his career, was when he was with the Red Wings as well. I believe he went there after Boston, because he went to Boston, I know there's New York, Boston, and Detroit, like the original 6 teams. But yeah, Park. And then Pat Verbeek. Little ball of hate, Pat Verbeek. He played with the Detroit Red Wings as well. Didn't play long enough that a lot of people would necessarily remember, but there you go. He was a Red Wing list, and there are others I could have thrown on there. But there you go. The best of the Detroit Red Wings, in other words, Gordie Howe, and that's kind of where the Red Wings are at. But again, I can understand too, people will make the argument for Yzerman, because there is always going to be that recency bias. And the further into the past you go, the more arguments people will have against a guy's stats, the more they'll have an argument against that player's overall accomplishments and saying it wasn't the same game, which is true, but I don't think it diminishes the players who played before. But let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.